let's see, I'm just trying to think if I should tell this or not, because if my mom will never watch these videos. They used to take me to church, and that's good. See, I think that's a good thing. But, you know, when they took me to church when I was a kid, I remember it was a very traditional church. I don't want to mention any names, you know, but it was very traditional, denominational church, and very formal. See, and it was all everything was laid out what you do. You know, of course, I don't know. I criticize that, but you know, I mean, I get into patterns, and we do kind of the same thing all the time. Anyway, it was, to me as a child, it was so boring. It was so dull. You know, I say sometimes jokingly, it drove me to prayer, and my prayer was, "Oh God, let me never see the inside of that place again," because it was so boring and so dull. But I got the impression, just sort of by osmosis, I can't really remember specifically anything that was ever said, but I got this impression. I got this impression that the Christian life consisted of a long list of things you're supposed to do. Things you are supposed to do, that's what the Christian life consisted of. And then there was this other list of things you weren't supposed to do. So two big lists. A list of things you were supposed to do, and frankly, growing up, I'll just be honest with you, I wasn't much interested in doing most of those things. Can I be that honest? And then on this list of things you weren't supposed to do, well, frankly, there's some things on there that sounded kind of interesting. And the more they talked about them, you weren't supposed to do those things, the more interesting they sounded. So I thought to myself, I can't be a Christian because all the things they say you're supposed to do, I'm not interested in. And all the things they say you're not supposed to do, they all sound, the more they talk about it, the more interesting they sound. And so I thought, I just dismissed the idea. And I thought, it's not for me to be a Christian. Because I thought it was all about things you're supposed to do. Do. In other words, duties, burdens, and obligations, of which I wasn't much interested. Because frankly, in life, there's already, as you grow up, beginning to be more and more obligations and things, and I thought I got enough trouble without going to church and getting more trouble. See what I'm saying? And there's a passage of, you know, I guess it takes a while for us to finally hear. That was a misconception, by the way, but I think a lot of people share that misconception. And I think it's possible to even come to church and sit in church and have that kind of misconception reinforced, mistakenly, I hope. But if you actually pick up the New Testament and read it for yourself, I find that it's not that way at all. In fact, it's just the opposite. That's what I find. In fact, I want to read a passage today. This is one of my favorites, and sometimes I just kind of gravitate to some of my favorite passages. This is in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 11. Of course, Matthew is a book that's written, it's called one of the Gospels. It's a telling, an account of the life of Jesus. And surprisingly, Jesus doesn't come along with a list of things for you to do, with a list of duties, burdens, and obligations, surprisingly. I say surprisingly because we have that misconception. In fact, it's just the opposite. In Matthew chapter 11, verse 28, here's what we read. This is Jesus talking. And he says, look at this now. "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Now, I don't know how you take that, but when I read that, it sounds to me like just the opposite of wanting to give you burdens. He wants to take away burdens. That's what it sounds like to me. Is that how you read that? In fact, he says, he presumes or he assumes that there may be people out there that are already carrying burdens and laboring. He says, "You that labor and are heavy laden, come to me, and I'll make it worse." No, he didn't say that. See, I read it wrong. Come to me, he doesn't say, "and I'll make it worse." He says, "Come to me and I'll give you rest." He doesn't say, "I'll pile on more. I'll give you more things to do. I will give you rest." Now, to me, when I read the word rest, that means a cessation of labor. Now, the labor and the burdens he's talking about are not, he's not speaking on a carnal, on a physical plane. He's not talking about the life of going to work, getting up and going to work. He's talking about on the spiritual level. He's talking about on a higher plane. Now, you know, in real life, in ordinary life, I say real life, in ordinary life, you know, we get up and go to our jobs, and we do our work, but that's not the kind of labor he's talking about. There's another kind of labor that's far more oppressive, and that's the kind of labor and burden that goes on up here. And I know that's what he means because in the next verse, in verse 29, he says, listen to this, "Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest for your souls." Now that's how I know that the kind of rest he's talking about and the kind of labor and burden he's talking about are not outward or physical. He's talking about inward. And those are the worst kind. Those are the kind that are the hardest to deal with. The inward, and what he means by this, he says, let me read that again. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, or learn about me. Find out about me. See, this is the thing that, as growing up, I had all these misconceptions because I didn't know about him. I didn't really know about him. I had some things I thought and some ideas that kind of came to me, you know, by osmosis or by the culture or by, you know, kind of casually. But when I began to learn about him, I found that he was way different than I thought he was. He wasn't some cruel taskmaster, you know, condemning me and beating me over the head, so to speak, you know, finding fault with me. He's just the opposite. He says, let's see, what does he say about himself? I am meek and lowly in heart. That means humble. Jesus says, I am humble. He is a person of humility, not what we would expect. And he says, you will find rest for your souls. Now, when we read the word soul, sometimes we sort of think of that in a generic way to mean our inner self. And that's a way to look at it. You could say body is on the outside, soul is on the inside. But in the New Testament, there's actually two different words that refer to your inner self. One of them is, in the Greek language, it's pneuma, which means spirit. It's usually translated spirit. This word, though, is a different word. In the Greek language, it's psuche, spelled P-S-U-C-H-E. P-S-U-C-H-E in the Greek language, from which this is translated. And if you saw it in print, you would look at it and you would say, that looks very much like the English word psyche. The English word psyche is spelled P-S-Y-C-H-E. Psuche is P-S-U-C-H-E. And in fact, it means the same thing. Now, if I change it and say psyche, if I stand here and talk about the psyche, I think we immediately know what part of us that we're talking about. It's the part that the psychologist talks about or studies about, and that the people go to the psychiatrist or the psychologist to get help. And what part of their body or their selves do they go to the psychiatrist to get help for? Well, it's not the body. It's the part that has to do with the mind and the thinking and the will and the emotions, the part of us that is prone to restless thoughts and anxiety and those kinds of things. That's exactly, and that's, if we want to be specific, that is specifically the kind of rest that Jesus is saying that I will give to you here. Now, you know, don't get the wrong idea. Don't think that being a Christian means that we can we don't have to go to work anymore. We go to work, but you know what? You can go to work physically and be at rest mentally. That's better, isn't it? Or you can go to work physically and be tormented mentally, and that's bad. See, he wants to deliver us from this inward state of, let me read it again. Come unto me, verse 28. All ye that labor and are heavy laden, I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Now, when he says yoke, you know what a yoke is? A yoke is, we don't think about it, you know, we don't use that word so much nowadays because we don't employ a yoke when we do agriculture. But in some parts of the world, they still do. And in olden times, even in these parts, you know, when animals had to do the farm work, you know, if you have one animal, it can pull a plow. He's only got a certain amount of strength. But if you put two of them together and hook their necks together with this big wooden thing called a yoke, then you've doubled the amount of power, right? And so a yoke joins two things together. And I found out from studying this that it also had another purpose. That in yoking two animals together, sometimes it would be used this way. One animal might know how to do it, how to walk the row and walk in a straight line, and then another one might be young and not know how to do it, not know how to walk the course, you know, or the field, you see. And so you take the young animal and hook it together with the experienced animal, you yoke them together. And so the young one is there to learn, and he learns by walking along. When the experienced animal moves, they're hooked together, so they move together, you see. And really, what's happening is the big animal, the experienced animal, is really pulling all the weight. Do you hear that? Pulling all the weight, and the other one is just walking along, see? Just walking along with it, because they're yoked together. And I think that's the sense in which Jesus says, take my yoke upon you. In other words, get hooked up with me. Get connected to me. And see, here's what he has in mind, because he says, I'm going to give you rest. He's not saying, get hooked up with me and I'm going to make you pull. He's saying, get